restrictions. very comfortable chair. I appreciate that. Yeah. It's a good height for me. You chose well. You would know. I mean, that seems like a solid choice.
And we might have.
You're okay. We get really into it, just just subtly be like, that's it. Yeah. Just say accent like they did on the show. Yeah. You know what it is? I think of that really anti-community where, what is it? What's the play where the guy moves in the chair? You know, the play, it's like a mid-American play about the guy. It's a Miller play. It's a Miller play. It's like, I'm blanking on it. It's the immigrants and it's beautiful French, yeah. So they're like at one point, they're like, he's so strong, and he like lifts a chair, and it's like by like the side of it, and like, and everything moves out. That's a weird test of strength.
No, it's literally so.
That's right. I know. I do love the play. That's a very yes. It's a very good play. Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess we'll get started. Hi everyone, my name is Daniel Ciba. I'm the Director of Education here at Quintessence. I am coming on having been at this theater for a full year, and part of my initiatives are to really find ways that Quintessence can use the productions for our seasons to really think about community engagement and educational opportunities. So if you haven't yet, I do invite you to look at the education page of our website, because there's lots of upcoming opportunities that include our adult evening classes. We have an amazing dramaturg and playwright teaching a playwriting class that starts in November. Our Saturday morning acting classes for youth that we're very, very excited to continue this fall, as well as these post-show conversations. And we're planning to do this for every show of the season. It's always going to be the second Sunday. And so that's just a chance for me to invite a guest, and we'll chat a little bit. But this is really also our opportunity to reflect on the production, and so there will be plenty of times for your comments, your questions, and for us all to sort of think about the different things in each of the productions of the season. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Bess Rowan. Bess Rowan is a theater theorist, historian, and practitioner. Her work focuses on what she terms affective stage directions, which are stage directions written in ways that engage the physical and emotional responses of future theater makers. Her first book, The Lines Between the Lines, How Stage Directions Affect Embodiment, was published by the University of Michigan Press in October 2021. She currently works as an intimacy choreographer and continues her training with theatrical intimacy education. Bess also serves as the performance review editor of the Eugene O'Neill Review and the conference planner for the American Theater and Drama Society. So let's all welcome Bess. So I do want to talk a little bit about your book. So I'd love for you just to share with us a little bit about what your book on stage directions is and sort of the way that you're thinking about stage directions a little differently than perhaps scholars have in the past.
Yes, thank you for that, Dan. I'm wearing a pin of my book. It's very small, but that's what it looks like, tiny. I should have brought a real prop. But I guess it's appropriate actually for this play that I don't have a real prop. So I wrote this book about stage directions. It is the first full-length book about stage directions. Now, in case you don't know what a stage direction is, stage directions are generally the way we read plays now. They're the italicized lines that you don't say out loud in a play. So a play is composed of dialogue and then these like italicized parts that are like, here's what's really going on. You might have realized that this is why I'm here for this play, which has a lot going on that's not spoken out loud. But what I thought was interesting is the people who had talked about stage directions in the past were a lot of like, well, these are stage directions about entrances and exits. Here are stage directions about props and scenery. And then there are some acting ones. Those are not really that interesting to us. Which is funny because, yeah, so I'm trained as an actor and a director, and I'm also a scholar. And I was like, well, actually, there's a huge difference in how we write stage directions. As a performer, when you read those things, or as someone who's designing or directing or dramaturging, the playwright gives you a ton of information, not only in what's included in the stage directions, but in how those stage directions are written. Some of them have a tone, they're funny, some of them are very, some of them are dry, honestly, not Ionesco. But you know, there is a lot of information in there. And what I thought was interesting was the ones that stood out to me were ones that were engaging the imagination and experience of the people reading and performing these plays. I'll give you an example. The one that made me think of this idea is there's a playwright named Sarah Wool. She wrote a play called The Clean House in 2000, and there's a stage direction in it where there are two sisters, they're middle-aged women, and the stage direction says, for a moment, Lane and Virginia experience a primal moment in which they are 5 and 7 years old inside of their own heads, respectively. They are mad. Then they return quite naturally to language as adults do. So that is an entirely silent moment on stage, but it's super important to the plot. And I'm an only child. I think I know what that stage direction means anyway, because we do have a sense of like, okay, these are people with a history. They're angry. They're re-engaging this childhood moment of like, I'm really angry at you, and then they're like, nope, I am, you know, in my 40s right now. I can speak to you about being angry. So it's the kind of thing where a lot of times if you don't know that stage direction is there, you don't know what those people are performing, you should still be able to get the sense of what's happening in that scene. Even if you don't look at it and go, they're experiencing a primal moment in which they are 5 and 7 years old respectively. Like that reaction's probably not gonna happen unless you're me and you know the play. But what I think is fascinating about them is that there are so many ways of performing that, and yet there are so many correct ways of telling an audience that that's what's happening. And that's what I love about stage directions, is they are touching on this really old part of storytelling that's pre-verbal, that's about the sense you're getting from a character, from a scene, from a moment. And particularly fun in a play like this, I do not write about the chairs, but in the book there is a reference to The Bald Soprano, which is another very famous Ionesco play, because there are very few people who have written about stage directions, but one article talks about how the stage directions, 2 of them in The Bald Soprano, one is the clock strikes no times, and the other is the clock strikes 2.5 times. And talking about what does that mean? Like what is I think clock striking 2.5 times is easier than the clock striking no times. Because how do you do that, right? Like that's a fun design challenge, that's a fun acting challenge. But I also think those are just fun. Like those are fun moments of kind of asking you to be creative. And maybe the audience never knows, oh, the clock struck 0 times there. But there's something in that sense of play that if you're putting on The Bald Soprano, it's helpful to know that that's how the playwright is thinking about it, because that gives you a ton of information.
Yeah, the Bald Soprano was Ionesco's first play, and The Chairs is actually written very, very quickly after that, almost 2 years, right? So we're talking like 1952, the Bald Soprano, 1954 for The Chairs. So it really, really happens very, very quickly. And if you do have a chance to investigate the Bald Soprano, if you do have a chance to investigate The Chairs, there are some really, really interesting stage directions.
Yes.
The title of, we came up with this post-show conversation is "There is a Great Hullabaloo," right? And so Ionesco's word for that word hullabaloo is remue-menage, and that sentence literally translates to "there is a great stir." And so one of the translators, Donald Allen, translates that word as hullabaloo, which is just a fascinating word in and of itself. Our translator for this adaptation, Martin Crimp, who's a British playwright, he translates that as great commotion. But even then, in that sort of the dissimilarity between those different things, and again, you could sort of see the great chair ballet that happened in the middle of that is sort of representative of that section of that idea. So can you talk a little bit more about like how you think Ionesco uses stage directions in the chairs?
Sure. I pulled a couple of examples because I thought there were some really lovely ones that give you a sense of what's happening. So two that I pulled, and I want to say first that obviously Ionesco is writing originally in French. So anytime you're translating something, stage directions you're not hearing verbatim on stage because they're translated through the body. But here we've got words translated from another language into English, then translated to the body. And yet, I think we saw both a great hullabaloo and a great stir, right? So there are moments of this where the Venn diagram of those meanings kind of, there is an overlap. But yeah, the stage directions, Ionesco's very funny in his stage directions. I love a funny stage direction. So there's that whole part in the beginning where the old man keeps saying, finish your tea, right? Finish your tea. So the first stage direction after the first finish your tea is, there is no tea, obviously, right? Which is hilarious, right? Because like, okay, he's telling you, first of all, there is no tea, but he's also like, if you haven't figured it out by now, we're not gonna have any tea in this play, right? So he's giving you a sense, right, of like, not only the kind of tongue-in-cheek sense of humor, but also the material world of the play. There aren't props in this world. But then, of course, you know, one of the taglines of this show is like an invisible cast of thousands. The invisible cast of thousands in the chairs is all introduced through the stage directions. So if you're acting in the play, they have to be really clear as to when the people are coming in, where are they sitting, what's happening, are the people talking to each other, all of these things. All of the rest of the cast of characters sitting in these chairs, who we should have said nicely, we should have asked them to move before we sat down.
We didn't.
We're still sitting on their laps. You know, those people enter the space through the stage directions. But what I think is so fascinating is the very first stage direction where we see the two people talking to each other and talking to the young woman who arrives first, right? There's a very fascinating moment where she is clearly telling them an invisible story that we can't hear, and then she stops talking. So what you have, there's nothing being said during that entire time, but the actors have to understand, okay, here's the part where she's telling a story, and then it stops, and now we're sitting in silence. We've been sitting in silence the whole time. So here's his stage direction for that. The two old people smile, laugh even. They seem to be very happily listening to a story told by the invisible lady. We all saw that, right? Then a pause, a hiatus in the conversation. Their faces become devoid of expression. So I think I saw that I knew that I was going to talk about this stage direction, and I saw that moment exactly performed here. But you didn't probably know that stage direction beforehand, unless you did some very good reading, which props to you. But do you recognize the part that I'm talking about? Did you see that performed? Because I think even if you didn't have that, you know what that is. Like there was a moment where they were having a good time, and then suddenly there was an awkward moment, which had no oral difference from what we just heard, but it meant something completely different to us. So I think that Ionesco in this play both uses the stage directions to give you a feel that it should be funny, which was a big problem that people had with absurdism when they first encountered it, is like Waiting for Godot, obviously, famously Samuel Beckett's play, was pitched as a Laugh Riot comedy. People in this country did not think it was a Laugh Riot comedy, and it's not, depending on when you see it and who's performing it. But the comedy of this, he puts it in the stage directions, which Beckett does not, to give you the sense of like, it's okay, you're allowed to have fun. But in this play, he's also choreographing all of the characters you can't see in the stage directions.
Yeah, and before we open it up to your comments and questions, which we will value and really want to be part of this conversation, right? I do think it is important for us to pause just to talk a little bit about that word absurdism, right? So Martin Esslin in 1962, he categorizes 4 playwrights from France, from post-World War II, using this word absurdism. So it's Eugene Ionesco, Arthur Adamov, Jean Genet, and Samuel Beckett. But again, it's the thing that's so fascinating to me is like we now start, especially in theatrical scholar communities, start to think about absurdism like it's a genre, like it's a choice, when so many of the other isms, especially in France, naturalism, surrealism, symbolism, Dadaism, expressionism in Germany, those are like salons where like the artists come together and agree upon, they'll write a manifesto where they're all declaring like, here are the tenets of our things. The 4 playwrights who become these fathers of absurdism never had that conversation, right? There was something that this critic, Martin Esslin, sort of saw in these playwrights and started to connect them. So that word absurd just has some really, really interesting nuances, one of which is this mixture of existential philosophy alongside vaudeville comedy, right? Which is a very interesting juxtaposition of itself. But the other thing that, again, has circled through my head the moment I realized I was going to ask Bess to join us and talk about her book in relation to this play was that there's also this heavy reliance of these playwrights on stage directions to do so much work.
Yes.
I was reading a book by an Ionesco scholarly work by Deborah Gagensbauer, and she says Ionesco adamantly insisted that his stage directions be treated as an integral part of his play. And so that's from Ionesco's writing. And then, you know, there's been some conflict with the Beckett estate, where when productions stray too far, the famous example is the 1983 ART production of Endgame, where Beckett actually wrote, do you want to share that?
Yeah, sure. So in order to understand why this is a big deal, I first have to back up just a little bit to say that, no, you set me up perfectly for that. The history of stage directions, having italicized parts of the script, even though we make a big deal often of something like Exit Pursuit by a Bear in Winter's Tale, Shakespeare didn't write any stage directions. So those actually were in the text. If you've ever heard Shakespeare, they do a lot of like on bended knee, and then it's like, well, I'm supposed to be kneeling at that moment. They don't say to you, kneel down. I mean, sometimes the editions do now, but that was not in the original play scripts. So the idea that stage directions needed to be written down came from when playwrights and directors stopped doing their own plays. And suddenly, with the rise of printed plays, you might encounter a play that you didn't know anything about the people who wrote it, so you don't have the director going, oh yeah, you kneel at that part, don't worry about it. You know, that kind of conversation changes. So when things like that start being written down, they begin as records of the previous production. So to this day, you see a lot of that, of like people writing down, you know, this is what happened here. There's nothing necessarily specific about that makes the next production have to do something like that. So because they might not have come from the playwright. But what we see really beginning with George Bernard Shaw at the end of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century, there you see the stage directions start to be more fanciful and more in keeping with the style of the play. So that is a shift that then still people were ignoring them and being like, this is just a record of the previous production. A lot of times, even the more kind of fanciful ones. So people in production often cross out the stage directions and say, make your own for this play. Like, we're gonna just find it together. That is very difficult to do when you've got a style that's not naturalism. So if you're outside of realism in general, suddenly the stage directions tell you a lot about the style of the play. And if you cross out the stage directions, you kind of cross out part of the styles of the play. So people like Eugene O'Neill were very concerned about this, but Beckett's stage directions are so prescriptive. Like, they tell you the number of steps you're supposed to take at certain moments. And his estate would show up, and if you were not doing it, if you had not cast, he famously shuts down productions. Still, he's not alive, and his his estate shuts down productions, where if you try to do Waiting for Godot with women, there can't be any women in that play. They will close you down because women don't have prostates, is their reasoning. Very realistic for an absurdist play, but okay. So it's very interesting, these boundaries. So in 1984, actually, Beckett, there was a production done by Joanne Akalaitis. She directed it for ART, and she set this play Endgame in an abandoned subway. And the thing of the abandoned subway is it didn't have a window. And Beckett's stage directions call for a window. So he got word, he didn't actually see this production, but he got word that the production was set in a subway and didn't have a window. And he sent them a cease and desist, and he was like, you can't do this play in a subway because it doesn't have a window. And they did not actually shut the production down, but they actually ended up running the production with a lengthy note from Beckett in the beginning saying, all I ask in this play is a window, and you didn't do it. And I didn't see this play, but I can already tell you it's not my play because it doesn't have a window. And this is the kind of thing, like, there have been copyright lawsuits over productions of Beckett, particularly. It's not just him, but he is the most famous, and he has the most cantankerous estate who will go after you if you're not doing it the way that this person who's no longer alive to tell you how he would have interpreted it is. That's kind of what's gone on there. So it's interesting because he stands apart from the other folks here in that the other three playwrights that Dan mentioned are not doing that.
No.
They're not interested. And again, you can see the difference between Beckett's writing, again, like something like I'm thinking about Footfalls, where literally the actor takes, I believe it's 6 steps across the stage several times, and it's 6 steps each time. You're supposed to be counting them and counting the amount of time it takes you to cross the stage. So it's almost musical in its composition. It's like a score. You can tell just from the ones I just read you, that's not Ionesco. He's not telling you, okay, the chairs go in these exact places and you're gonna count 2 seconds between, he's like a great Hullabaloo. Go do what you want, right? Like that's a very different relationship between text and actor and text and production team than Beckett has.
No, and it's really, I think what's sort of interesting is even just thinking about this shift, right? As in the middle of the 20th century, you're welcome, have a lovely day. But having this shift where the stage directions are just another way of communicating meaning, right? If another thing that's connecting these absurdist playwrights is the devaluation of language, right?
Yes.
Sort of the way that communication doesn't quite function, then suddenly all of the nonverbal stuff becomes so much more important. And again, as important for these playwrights as the actual words that they're having people speak aloud.
Yeah, and that's honestly one of the things that became kind of, that's a major point I'm making in my book, which is controversial, believe it or not. It's controversial that the stage directions are part of the script we should consider, which I think is funny since they're in the script. And again, that like our great challenge as interpreters of plays is how do we do this script? What does it mean? And I do also think, again, going back to the Beckett-Ionesco difference there, is for people so concerned with how meaning falls out of language, to be suing people over not understanding your language or not doing it the way you want is funny to me, because it kind of goes against some of that process, right? Like some of that project overall. Yeah.
All right. So we welcome sort of any questions or comments. They can be about stage directions. They can be about your response to the play. Yeah, go ahead.
You were talking about the stage directions as part of the play.
Yes.
And coming from a literature background, we always, is this a division between theater people versus when we read
Yes.
Shaw in a class, his endless stage directions, very, both prescriptive and philosophical, are always part of our understanding of it. The question is, there seems to be like what you described, like 3 different, stage directions which are methodological, like do these number of steps, philosophical, sort of like Shaw, and then ones which are these more sort of prescriptive things that, not prescriptive, challenges, like, the clock doesn't strike, which are in some ways confrontational as opposed to descriptive. Is there a taxonomy for
Yes.
that?
My book is a taxonomy, in fact. Yes.
In your book,
Yes.
What's your taxonomy?
So my taxonomy, I think, first of all, to answer the first, before you even got to the question between literature and theater and studying these things, here's the thing. Studying them exactly like the dialogue doesn't work either, because their meaning doesn't come out the same way as the dialogue does on stage. So semiotically, in terms of how we make meaning, how symbols make meaning in language, stage directions cannot be held exactly the same way as spoken dialogue, which has a sort of more agreed upon set of meanings than how we physically, non-verbally interact. So I think that that's a trick of, like, neither of those approaches are right? Like, in terms of understanding the full meaning of a performed play. Reading it as literature isn't exactly the same thing, and reading it without any of the stage directions isn't exactly the same thing either. So you're right in that all of those approaches are contained within different kinds of writing, and there's a whole lot more too. So part of what I tried to identify was the reason I talk about affective stage directions is I think that contained in all of the things you just said is an attitude towards stage directions hidden in the stage directions, right? So some of the stage directions are playful. They're trying to get you to engage in certain ways. Some of them are pushing, and they're telling you that very explicitly in the way that they're written. And some of them are prescriptive, and they're like, I don't want to have a conversation, walk 6 steps to the left, right? Like, there's not anything to interpret there except how long your steps are, and maybe Beckett had feelings about that, I'm not sure. So the first, like, overall category is affective stage directions, which are just really a word to discuss the approaches a playwright makes in the stage directions. And that can contain anything, but it just means you have to be aware both of what's actually being said and of how the person is saying it, because both of those things together make the meaning.
And again, I think, right, so one of the things that often happens for, like, beginning directors and actors is you often talk about the world of the play, right?
Yes.
Like, that's a way of sort of taking the blueprint of this text on a page and, like, thinking about how it's going to be embodied, and sort of that you have to make choices as actors and directors and designers and all of those things, right? But again, what's really interesting to me is sort of thinking about, well, there's no reason why all stage directions should function the same way, right?
Yeah.
Every playwright might have their own attitude towards, like, oh, how I'm going to think about the embodiment, whether it's style or whether it's prescriptions or all these different things.
Yeah.
And just rhetorically, when you read them, that they're going to be different, and so you cue into the fact that Shaw's going to talk at you. Talk.
Sure. Yeah, he's going to tell you someone's entire backstory.
Right.
But I think an actor playing that character, it's like saying, yes, and she really hates figs, and there's no figs in the play. But that's something to know about yourself if you're playing that character, right?
Well, and the endless detail that he goes into is less, it's more about creating a state of mind, creating a world.
Exactly.
Whereas the ones that, I saw years ago the production of Ball Soprano, and they did that with lighting.
Same. I saw a production that did it with lighting too.
Basically, the
Worked
clock
super
not
well.
striking was done with,
Yes.
a pause.
Yeah.
Wait to the audience, light on the clock.
Yeah, and the actor's going, and nothing happens.
Right.
Well, speaking of lighting, is that smoke thing, is that in the script?
No, the fog is not necessarily called for.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting to think about, like, what do you do as a director, as actors, when suddenly you have to invite a whole bunch of imaginary people on stage with you, right? Like, the first time, is there something about, like, oh, we're just getting the conceit, right? Like, we're just getting information. And then another person, okay, and so then there are two. All right, so I think the way that I sort of think about that choice, not actually having had a conversation with our director, artistic director, Alex Burns, who directed this piece, is like just differentiation, right? Just sort of like upping the stakes of the imaginary people throughout the course of the play.
And also, you know, there are stage directions there, and then there are some stage directions that, there are choices you saw on stage that don't actually connect to anything written in the script. And part of what my argument is that, for example, going back to the idea of impossible stage directions, things that say, you know, the clock strikes no time, which doesn't tell you what to do, is that gives you a sense of the world of the play, and then you're allowed to add. Like, you're allowed to kind of say, okay, I understand what that is. And I think that the more impossible the things are, like the impossibility of inviting a bunch of people on stage, that spurs an amazing part of creativity, right? Like, it gives you a lot of choices, a great challenge, but also a great opportunity. And that then, like, now it's hard to differentiate what's the director's choice and what was, you know, in keeping with what Ionesco wrote down initially. And that's part of the fun.
Well, and there certainly wasn't, at least in my multiple readings of the play, confetti cannons, right?
No.
But to think about, like, what is the contemporary choice
Yeah.
that's going to accentuate the fun,
Yeah.
right? So it's not just being bogged down in the more despair moments, the more sort of desperation. And again, the more pieces of absurdism that I see, it's really about, like, having those two things that seem very drastically different really hold the same space. Is that we can almost cry at the old woman's monologue and then almost immediately laugh at the old man's response. Or again, response is the wrong word, but just the next thing.
The next thing
that he has, and sort of hold those things together in some really interesting ways. Other
So
questions?
what about the orator who doesn't speak signs, which the audience, unless you're fluent in the language, doesn't get? But really, it comes and says nothing,
Yeah.
and writes gobbledygook.
Yeah. The orator is a really interesting part of the script.
Okay.
I think, you know, the choice to have an actor who is part of the deaf community and sort of contribute signs
Yes.
as part of that is also not something in Ionesco's text. But for me, really speaks to that. Again, you know, you have a character. He is supposed to deliver this message. He comes out. He cannot deliver the message vocally. He cannot deliver the message through writing. And so sort of having that be another sort of like what Bess was just saying, right? Like, it's what do we do creatively that speaks to our time.
And again, in keeping with the idea of the play, right, which is like the orator is not going to talk. Like the orator, because no one does what they're supposed to do in these plays. Like that's literally the every time, you know, there's a set up expectation and it's let down, and that's actually the thing that we get to be used to at the end. And yeah, so in making a choice that is in keeping with everything you got, all the information you get from the dialogue and the stage directions, continuing that into a way that is more inclusive, and that, you know, Ionesco wasn't writing, you know, who knows if he would have thought more about the other kinds of actors he could include, but he didn't think like that at the time. So it's our job to kind of figure out the contemporary version of that thing.
Yeah, did you want
I was just wondering, was Martin Crimp's, was it mainly a translation, or was it
It's a
more
great
than
question.
translation?
In the translation, thank you. In the translation adaptation version discussion, many translators today believe that every translation is an adaptation because it's kind of impossible to directly translate.
well, and if you're doing, like, if you're really trying to do a literal translation,
Yeah.
sort of the theory is that, like, the embodiment won't happen,
Yeah,
right?
you'll
If you're
lose.
just translating word for word,
Right.
idioms and sort of the larger meaning won't be what actually happens, is that you have to put it through a filter.
And Martin Crimp is a famous playwright actually in his own right. He's in a different tradition. His tradition is called in-your-face theater, which is a very particular 90s brand of British, it says exactly what it is. It's a very extreme, aggressive form of theater. So it's fascinating to me that he did a translation / version of this play. Now, is it exactly like what you just saw? No. Because it has a little bit more of him in it, but it's still, there are aspects of this play that feel confrontational in certain ways, right? They're not breaking the fourth wall and like coming in and attacking you, but they're confronting your theatrical expectations in a very aggressive way. We are observed, even when actors are not looking directly at us. There's a lot of like, we are also sitting in chairs out behind these chairs, right? So it is technically a translation, but it's also a version, I would say. I wouldn't quite call it an adaptation in that it still follows the same trajectory.
Yeah.
But yeah,
that adaptation word usually means that there's been sort of liberties, right? Like there's additional scenes that weren't in the original, or,
yes.
and again, what does original mean in terms
Well,
of
and
this
that's-
word of adaptation?
And that's exactly what's so fascinating about translators grasping onto that word and saying like, I'm adapting this, because the language can't be the same. So like anything I do is it's an adaptation of that original story. And that's fascinating, but that's not usually how we use that word.
How did Ionesco write the, like the stage direction for the narrator? Yeah.
The orator?
The orator at the end,
Yeah, I mean,
I
I'm just wondering how that.
there's almost nothing there.
Yeah, it's very,
It's-
very
yeah.
like not sort of giving information.
Yeah.
And I think it's also really interesting to think about this as a play where, you're waiting for that meaning of life to come, and then to like have so little information at the end.
Yeah.
As to like what that embodiment is.
Yes.
Not even the frustration of not being able to communicate with us. That wasn't there.
No, that's not there at all. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, he comes out and then it's over. Like he can't, which is a thing that, it also, sorry, rule's coming up a lot today for some reason. There's another play she wrote called Dead Man's Cell Phone, which at the end of Act 1, the man who's the eponymous dead man whose cell phone it is, walks out on stage and he opens his mouth and the lights go out. he's like about to tell us what happened, and then we get nothing. And then at the beginning of Act 2, we get it back. But it's a very funny moment because you're ready to hear him, and then like he's ready to communicate with us, and we don't get it. None for us.
I did feel, because I was sitting this way.
Yeah.
And all the chairs were like that, I did feel as though.
You were part of it, yeah.
But we were waiting too,
Yeah.
Well, that's sort of the really lovely thing about doing this production in an intimate space, right? Where like we're actually like looking at the architecture of the Sedgwick Theater. I mean, again, like even thinking about the archways and everything. So we're really part of that audience of people.
Is it always set up like this?
The theater space? No.
Oh, you mean for the chairs?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
So they're actually
Other production.
in the Donald Allen production, and I'm always struck by this. There's actually a diagram
Oh, my.
of,
Yeah, yes.
of sort of what the set should look like and what the chairs and where the chairs should be placed.
Yes.
Again, I don't know sort of what the deviation of that, but it would be really interesting to think about like what a production of this sort of in a different arrangement would be, as opposed to thinking about the proscenium and having the audience as an extension. Like what would an in the round version with audience on multiple sides be?
I've seen production photos of ones where the chairs are facing the audience,
Oh.
which is a very big shift.
Huh.
Yeah, where like
Interesting.
you're looking at all of the fronts of the chairs for the whole time, which I think is different. Because I think in the diagram it does tell you which direction the chairs are supposed to be facing, right? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
In your book, do you talk about the relationship between stage directions and the choices about setting that directors make?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of, again, what I'm fascinated by is that there are a lot of assumptions we have about like famous productions of things that did sets that were particular ways, but there's nothing in the stage directions that says that it should be like that. And a lot of times people make design stage directions that actually, instead of saying like there are two chairs and they're up left, they're upstage right and they're downstage left, that there's things that are like, it should feel like this. It feels like an intimate bedroom or something like that. There's one of my favorite ones is from a play called Appropriate by a playwright named Brandon Jacobs Jenkins. And it's a sound design note And it says, it's like, it feels like there are 100 million cicadas around you. They're singing the song of death and life, and they're, what's gonna happen in the future, but we don't understand it because they're cicadas. And they're singing, and now you feel like the sound is in the aisles, and it's around you, and it's touching you, it's getting closer to you. And there should be a moment when each audience member thinks, is this the whole show? Because that's how the show opens. So it's like, you're supposed to be sitting there long enough, and like, what does that mean? What is that amount of time that makes you sit there and go, is this the entire thing? And I think that's fascinating because like, that's very specific. Cicadas is specific. But the rest of that, there's a lot of words there. They don't necessarily create the same experience each time. But back to the like litigation discussion again, people have actually sued over stage directions, interpreting stage directions in a specific way for set design, and then repeating that set design for the next time, even though the stage directions don't say that exactly. People have sued over that too, which then created a very strange connection, like division between stage directions, the written down things in the page, and stage directions, the director's idea of the stage, which in legal terms are the same words, but they don't mean the same thing in actual point of fact.
Well, that's like such an Ionesco thing.
Right, yeah, it's like, yeah. The stage directions which are not the stage directions. Yeah.
Wonderful. So thank you all so much for joining
Thank you.
us. I do hope that you'll, we do have a fabulous scholar who's going to come for our Mary Poppins. Her focus is actually on Disney, and she's going to talk, her name is Kristen Mandrakia, and she's going to talk about the collective authorship of Mary Poppins when we have that discussion. So I hope you'll all be able to join us at that point.
Thank you.
Thank
you so much. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. They're connected. Yes. So absurdism is the name. So if it were just metaphysical and had no comedy, then how would that be? Because it's got comedy in it. That's what absurdism is, the blend of like the nihilism and the like comedic, like, well, it's we're all gonna die, but isn't that funny? Instead of we're all gonna die, it's not Nietzsche, right? Like it's very clear. Yeah. Yeah. You're so welcome. Thank you so much for asking good questions and for coming.
Trying to do your phone number.
Oh, yes, I do. I do. Okay. Made it. Thank you. Oh, fair.
Do you have 5 minutes, or do you?
Yeah, I have 5 minutes.
Okay.
I want to see that cool thing.
Yeah, I'll bring you around.
I want to see the cool architecture.
Oh. I do have to run, but thanks for
Thanks for hanging out.
Good to see you again.
It was good to see you too.
See you next time.
Yes.
I took a lot of pictures. You can pick whatever.
Amazing.